Hi, Michaela Lafrac here. The podcast you are about to listen to has been edited for clarity and brevity. This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. One topic seems to be dominating the conversation at the Vermont State House this session and at many dinner tables across the state. That topic is property taxes. They were expected to rise by an average of nearly 20% next year because of the size of school budget proposals. Lawmakers are now trying to figure out how to keep property taxes from growing so drastically. Right now, they're rewriting the state's education tax laws to induce some districts to go back to the drawing board and cut spending. If this happens, some school budget proposals could be pushed back past town meeting day to later this spring. So that could really change what you see on the ballot on town meeting day on March 5th. Today on the show, we're going to talk about how we got here. We'll speak with the head of Vermont's School Board Association and Vermont's Secretary of State. She's been in conversation with town clerks all across the state who are trying to make sure they are ready for town meeting day, whatever it might bring. But first, to orient us, we are joined by Vermont Public's education reporter, Lola Dufour. She's been following this story's developments closely for us. Lola, welcome.
Hey, Michaela.
Thanks for being here, talking more about taxes than I know you already have. This is a complicated one, right?
It is really complicated. We just in the office, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how we can explain this to people because it is just an unbelievably dense system.
Yes, but could affect many of our lives in lots of different ways. Now, Lola, you have been very busy these past couple of weeks covering the legislature and this bill that would partially rewrite Vermont's school tax formula. Before we get to this change, first, what got us to this point?
Yeah, so I think it's probably important to say at the outset, and we'll also I'm sure talk about this later, but taxes and the tax formula is not the only reason that we are seeing this increase. There's an incredible inflationary environment at play here that is pushing school spending up. However, having said that, a key culprit, lawmakers believe, for this increased spending is a transition mechanism that they built into Act 127. This was a law that was passed in 2022, and it was a much larger, very important revamping of Vermont's education finance formula. And, this essentially temporary tax break, which was built into this much larger reform effort, there's a concern that this temporary tax break is basically encouraging certain school districts to maximize spending this year and is kind of adding to what would be kind of natural growth in spending.
2022, that's not that long ago. Did something change that caused this, everyone's eyes to pop open this year about it?
Well, it's going into effect this year,
okay.
Right? So it was passed in 2022, but this is the actual first year in which it's actually in effect.
Okay, so it's going into effect, and people are like, okay, so this might not work exactly as we were hoping. So the Democratic lawmakers are now getting together to work on tweaking it. That's right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, I think it might be helpful to kind of explain what this law was intended to do, because I think that might elucidate where it's kind of breaking down. So, there is this recognition that certain categories of students should cost more to educate. That's low-income students, that's English language learners, that's students in rural settings, right? So some kids should cost more. And lawmakers actually wanted school districts to spend more on those kids, on higher need kids. But in, Vermont has a really interesting education funding scheme in that the state does not decide how much individual school districts spend. Individual school districts make those decisions by themselves with their voters on town meeting day. But the lever that is available to lawmakers is basically the taxing incentives or disincentives that they build into the school finance formula that pays for the education fund, which pays for the kind of total bill that is approved on town meeting by school districts, right? So the lever that the state has is, how it taxes communities to create incentives to spend or hold the line. When it determines sort of what each community's fair share into the education fund is. So Act 127 basically created incentives for districts with those higher need students to spend more without a commensurate rise in taxes. That was the intent, right? And but kind of the other side of that coin was that districts that were wealthier, less rural, more homogenous, right, that didn't have kids who were learning English, they would experience the opposite effect. They would see their tax rates increase even without big spending jumps. Now, whenever you have, people who are communities that are going to lose in a big piece of legislation, you usually want to include some sort of transition mechanism so they can adjust, right? And this transition mechanism is what is kind of creating these problems this year. And it's this 5% cap that lawmakers wrote into this law. So lawmakers said in the first 5 years of this law's implementation, we are going to cap property rate increases for homestead for homeowners. This doesn't apply to the non-homestead rate. It applies to the homestead rate. And so now there's this concern that because this cap is in effect, the school districts that we didn't want to see increase their spending are also increasing their spending more than they would have otherwise because their tax rate is kind of artificially capped. And so that is kind of what has brought us here. And lawmakers are now considering removing this cap.
And yes, as you said, lawmakers are coming in trying to fix this problem. And specifically, those lawmakers are the lucky members of the House Ways and Means Committee right now. The chair, Representative Emily Kornheiser, was on Vermont Edition yesterday. And here's how she characterized the issue.
We have this extraordinary system in Vermont where we trust local communities to say how much they need and then trust that Vermont property taxpayers can pick up that bill. And right now we're experiencing a perfect storm. And I really think it's helpful to compare it to the kind of natural disasters that we actually see in a storm, in that we had all of these different things happen at once. We saw a significant increase in healthcare costs. We saw a significant increase in student need, right, in the aftermath of the pandemic. We saw teachers, we saw a teacher shortage and teachers struggling after working through the pandemic, and so needing higher pay. We've seen the cost of heating schools and school transportation going up. And all of those, and then the cost of school construction going up. And so all of these costs were all increasing simultaneously. And our existing tax system was not necessarily as nimble as it could have been to sort of catch up with it. And so we are spending this session making a series of changes to make sure that Vermonters can continue to fund our schools in a way that works for them.
And you can hear Lola, Representative Kornheiser, really choosing her words carefully there, I think in an effort, as we all are, to try to explain this really complicated issue in a way that is accessible to listeners. I really liked that metaphor of the perfect storm that she brought up too. That reminds me a lot of the point you were making earlier about all these different pressures on hitting schools right now.
Yeah. And so the point that Emily Kornheiser was making is so important for two reasons. reasons. One, exactly what you're pointing out, right? So schools are genuinely being hit with, frankly, unprecedented inflationary pressures. And second, that inflationary environment is actually interacting with that tax break that everyone is so concerned about in very unexpected ways. So when lawmakers created this transition mechanism, they did some modeling to try and figure out what it would look like. But the financial environment that they were modeling this in was dramatically different. This was like 2019. This was pre-pandemic. And so, a tax break, a transition mechanism that should have made sense is now interacting in a different financial environment and is not acting the way that people thought it would. And the big thing that's happening really is that a lot more school districts ended up kind of availing themselves of the cap than was anticipated because of that inflationary environment. So one kind of analogy that we've been using is like, okay, what if you went to the grocery store and they gave you a coupon that said, for this trip only, whatever you buy, we won't charge you more than $100. Now, if inflation wasn't going crazy, you might just be like, well, I'll spend $40 anyways. I don't want to spend $100. But if inflation is crazy and you're going to have to spend $100 to get like just the basics, then the incentives change, right? And all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm going to have to spend $100 anyways, but I can't be charged more. So I might as well get this week's basics and also like stock the pantry with dry goods, right? And so what has happened is a lot of school districts kind of naturally were going to hit the cap, and then thought to themselves, well, our schools are falling apart. Let's park an extra $3 million in the capital reserve fund because, our taxes are going to go up an uncomfortable amount, but then they can't go up even higher. So it has like perversely incentivized even more spending in ways that kind of, if you're just looking at your individual school district budget, are actually like quite financially prudent, right? The problem is the aggregate impact of that. Of a bunch of school districts kind of making that decision have created this kind of crazy cascading effect and kind of knocked the ed fund off balance. And it's had like kind of two really important impacts. A, it's kind of canceled out the benefits for those school districts that were supposed to, we wanted to see spend more without their taxes going up too high. And it's just driven up taxes in general. And because of this cascading effect, there was this concern that like literally every school district in the state was going to hit this cap. And then the only way to relieve that pressure was going to be on the non-homestead rate, right? So imagine if like on average the homestead rate or homestead property tax bills go up 20%, but then the non-homestead rate goes up like 25 or 30, right? Imagine like every landlord, every business owner getting hit with that kind of tax increase. So that is kind of where we are sitting, or where lawmakers were sitting when they, decided to kind of go back to the drawing board and rewrite at least a portion of the tax code.
And briefly here, so the fix that they're proposing is to repeal that 5% cap and replace it with what exactly?
Well, it's basically a less generous and much more targeted transition mechanism, right? So they still want to give those school districts that were going to kind of lose out under Act 127 a chance to adjust. But now they're giving them a cent discount that is based on the kind of specific tax capacity that they've calculated that they lost under Act 127. The goal is basically to encourage some school districts to cut spending, right? And the way that they hope this will be achieved with this new transition mechanism is that it's going to basically, the hope is, reinsert some logic into the relationship between in individual districts' tax rate and how much they decide to spend during town meeting. Because before, with the cap in place, because of this crazy cascading effect, right, how I had talked about how it's knocking the ed fund off balance, you were seeing school districts who not only had an incentive to spend more, but it had a disincentive to cut stuff out of their budget because the fund had been sent into like such a weird, bizarro world that school districts were looking at scenarios in which they could cut like $2 million out of their budget and not see their tax rate decrease, right? So there was no penalty for spending more, and there was no rewards for spending less. And this transition mechanism is trying to recreate a reward for spending less and a penalty for spending more. And of course, I'm oversimplifying in a lot of different ways because this is so dang complicated. But that's the basic logic at play here.
Well, I want to ask you a question that we just got in an email from Steve in Westminster West, who says the local control issue that keeps coming up related to property taxes, to me, is a red herring and a distraction from the inequities and burden the current system imposes on economically vulnerable homeowners all over Vermont. It's too expensive to start a home, and it's too expensive to maintain one, especially on a fixed income during our later years. Yesterday's wealth tax discussion on Vermont Edition reminded me, Steve writes, that education funding based on an income tax formula is much more equitable and would give homeowners a boost and local municipalities more flexibility. Where is the discussion about this in Montpelier? Lola, have you heard any discussion about an income tax formula for education funding bubbling up again?
Yeah. I mean, this is an issue that has been bouncing around Montpelier basically as long as since the 90s. But I would say, if anything, that discussion has lost steam in Montpelier. I mean, I was talking to Emily Kornheiser about this, who's probably one of the most progressive Democrats in Montpelier. And, she told me I used to believe that was the answer. And then I sat on a big, committee that studied this issue. And now I'm actually less convinced. I actually do think it's more complicated. That being said, I do think that lawmakers are taking a hard look at the often regressive nature of Vermont's property taxes, even though they are income sensitized to a certain extent, right? So, I think that in general, this is a discussion that lawmakers are going to be having, but I would be very skeptical that they are going to go for a straight income tax for schools anytime soon.
Well, let's get back to this legislation, where it stands now. What is the timeline here, and when are we going to know what exactly is going on with town meeting day?
I mean, that's the big question, right? It did pass out of House Ways and Means, which was, the committee that kind of crafted this. It has not yet hit the floor in the House. That could definitely happen this week. When lawmakers talk about this, they say they want to get it done very quickly in a matter of weeks, but we really won't know until it happens, right? So we won't know what's going on with town meeting day until this bill is signed, sealed, and delivered, and it still has to go through the House. It still has to go through the Senate. So it could be quite quick, but very much to be determined.
Vermont Public Education reporter Lola Dufour, I hope soon that you will be able to go back to talking to some kids in schools and not just about taxes, though we are very grateful for your expertise on this subject. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, to talk us through the town meeting day element of this story, we are joined from Montpelier by Vermont's Secretary of State, Sarah Copeland-Hanzus. Her office manages voter registration and election procedures, among many other things. Secretary Copeland-Hanzus, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Michaela.
And listeners, of course, you can join this conversation as well. Do you have questions about how town meeting day is going to work, or broader election-related questions for the Secretary of State? Give us a call. Our number is 800-639-2211, or send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Now, First, Secretary, before we get into this big to-do over school budgets, let's talk more broadly about town meeting day. It's in 3 weeks, and it's a big one because it's not just local issues that people are going to be voting on. What elections are coming up?
So on the weekend of town meeting, leading up to town meeting day, depending on which community you live in, you might be taking a floor vote on a Saturday and then coming back again on a Tuesday for a ballot vote. And in addition to voting on your local municipal issues and some communities voting on their school budgets, we all have the opportunity to participate in the presidential primary this year. And so that will bring, I think, a lot more traffic, a lot more folks out to the polls to express their preference on the presidential primary. And so it's going to be a busy couple of days coming up.
Yeah, and for somebody who maybe is new to Vermont, hasn't voted on town meeting day before, what types of things are usually on local ballots?
So for communities who are doing their town meeting by Australian ballot, you can see, articles that range from, shall we support the visiting nurses, or shall we appropriate to our local teen center? You can see questions about who your next select board or city council will be. You'll see an overall budget number and oftentimes an opportunity to adopt the date and means by which your community will collect those local property taxes.
Wow. Well, speaking of taxes, some lawmakers are rewriting the state's education tax laws, which means that some school budget votes could be postponed until later in the spring. Now, you are charged with guaranteeing fair and equal elections throughout the state of Vermont. What is your role exactly in implementing these possible changes?
So for us, it's really important that we have clarity on the timeline of what's coming out of the legislature so that we can give good advice to our local town and city clerks. Many school districts have a relationship with a municipal clerk in order to help conduct that school district's elections. Some school districts have their own school district clerk, but overall, elections that are conducted in Vermont are led by our town and city clerks. And so it's really important for us to give them advice on what to do if, for instance, they already have ballots that are out in the hands of voters. What do they do if they receive those ballots back in? There are a lot of decisions.
What do they do? What do they do? That seems complicated.
Yes. No, it is. I wanted to say that this was a curveball, but it's a little more than a curveball. Yeah. So it really depends on what the school district decides to do, because the school district is probably voting on more than just their budget. They're probably electing school board members as well. And so any individual school district board might decide to go forward with their election of officers, but delay the vote on the budget so that they can rewarn and recalculate based on what's coming out of the legislature. So our municipal clerks who are trying to prepare to conduct these elections really have to wait and see what the school district plans to do in order to know whether they're printing a whole new ballot, whether they're conducting a whole new election on another day. If ballots are already out in the hands of voters and the school district wants to delay only the budget vote, then voters can go ahead and return the rest of that ballot, and the clerks will simply disregard the results of the budget vote.
So even if somebody filled out that budget vote and it's going to be changed, they just wouldn't count it and ask them to vote on it later. Okay.
Yeah. And I would just recommend to folks that if you have uncertainty about what your school district is doing and whether the ballot you have in hand is the one that you should be returning, just give your municipal clerk a call. Chances are she or he will know what to expect, and we'll be able to give folks advice on whether to return that school district ballot or whether they'll receive a new one.
Maybe bring them some cookies or a scented candle while you're at it. I think they probably need it. Well, let's add one more voice to the conversation here. We also have with us today Sue Siglowski. She's the executive director of the Vermont School Board Association, and they have been closely involved in these discussions about how schools create budgets and whether communities will pass them. Sue, welcome.
Thank you, Michaela. I'm happy to be here.
Well, Sue, what have your past couple weeks been like? How did we get to this moment?
Well, the past couple of weeks have definitely been challenging for school board members, and I think that challenge is not quite over yet. They're going to be working in the coming days to decide whether they're going to delay their vote on their budget or possibly their entire annual meeting, or whether they'll just go forward as usual on town meeting day if that's when they normally hold their vote.
And how many school boards are in the association? How many different groups are you a liaison with right now?
There are 122 school districts in Vermont, so 122 school boards.
And do you believe that the 5% cap that we were talking about with Lola earlier in today's show did indeed lead some districts to increase their budgets?
I think that there are some districts that looked at the 5% cap and considered their circumstances, the needs of their district, possibly looking at facilities needs that have gone unfunded for several years because of lack of school construction aid, things like that, and may have added some items to their budget based on that. And they may be going back now and taking a second look at that.
Well, we're getting some calls coming in, and listeners, if you have questions, we have with us the head of the executive director of the Vermont School Board Association, Sue Siglowski, as well as Sarah Copeland-Hansis, Vermont's Secretary of State. Let's start with Elizabeth in Norwich. Elizabeth, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, I've heard mention of income sensitivity in the past comments and that it really wasn't going to be addressed now. And it's just really become a joke. It's not kept pace with inflation of real estate values or the level of taxation. And to the point that in our town, we will be looking at paying 20% of our income on property taxes. It's going up 40% in our town. And you talk to anyone around, and we all are literally thinking of moving. How could we can't possibly pay that? And so I just, say a wealthy district, but that doesn't mean everyone is wealthy. And I think it's really irresponsible and inconsiderate of the legislature to hastily put something out there that hasn't been thought through and is going to upend our lives.
Elizabeth, thank you for that call. Sue, I'm wondering what your thoughts are there. Elizabeth, again, was calling from Norwich.
Well, that is certainly a valid concern, and that's one of the reasons why we have asked the legislature to do everything that it possibly can to reduce the property tax challenges. This would necessitate finding some additional non-property tax revenues for the next fiscal year, and we certainly believe there's a compelling case for increasing revenues to the education fund in order to offset property taxes this year.
Well, let's go back to the phones. We have a call from Jim Carroll in Bennington. I believe that's Representative Jim Carroll. Welcome.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
With respect to delaying the vote for a school budget, when ballots have already been printed and been sent out, can we, through a floor vote, postpone the vote on the budget?
Secretary?
So I think we would be looking back to Act 1 of 2023, which, as you recall, was the extension of COVID flexibilities that were put in place during 2020 to give all of the flexibilities that school districts or municipalities might need in order to not force people to gather in an in-person meeting in order to conduct their business. So the provisions of Act 1 allow the legislative body, so either in this case the school board, or if a select board wanted to delay town meeting, they still have the ability to under Act 1 of 2023. So in this case, it would not be the floor voters at a school district meeting who would be making that decision. It would be the legislative body.
That was Representative Jim Carroll, a Democrat calling from Bennington. Thanks for your call. We also have Robert and Bethel on the line. Robert, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hey, Michaela, thank you. This is a great conversation that we all should listen to. And Madam Secretary, I'm happy that you're joining us. Rick, your phone answering guy, asked me what are my two most important issues. And I think Vermonters need to understand that 85% of your property taxes go directly to your supervisory unions. So I think the school board should be taken out of the equation. It happens at a much higher level with the supervisory unions. Right now, there are 54 supervisory unions in Vermont, and we're paying for all that infrastructure. And the female caller before your last caller, mentioned a great reason to have to actually force yourself to leave Vermont. It's the property taxes. And our per student rate in the country is at $27,000 per student, and our rating nationally is about 40. We're like 45th in the country, so we're not getting the punch for our dollar, and we're all struggling. Tomorrow is tax day in Bethel, and I have to pay 85% to the school supervisor union directly.
I'm going to jump in here, Robert, because I would love for Sue Siglowski with the Vermont School Board Association to address your concern. Robert here saying schools need to reduce costs. Sue, what are the costs that schools are facing that are causing these increases?
Well, there are some significant inflationary pressures that are happening to schools right now that are, as everyone knows, affecting society as a whole. We also have a worker shortage that's impacting employers statewide and causing an increase in salaries. There are significant increases in health insurance costs. And added to that is the role that schools have taken on in helping students who have increasing mental health needs. The fact that over 60% of our school buildings are approaching the end of their useful life. And Vermont has had no school construction aid for the past almost 2 decades. We also have that each year the General Assembly imposes new obligations for schools that often will have cost implications at the local level. And finally, the federal pandemic funds are going away this year, and we're seeing that many of the detrimental effects of the COVID pandemic have remained, causing some districts to retain some of the federally funded positions in order to contend with those.
Can you
so that's
explain
a long
that
list.
a little bit more? Because I wanted to ask you about those pandemic funds that came in from the federal government led to more spending in schools. And there are some expenses, as you just said, that have remained on school budgets post-pandemic and post-pandemic funds. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes. The federal pandemic funds were used in different ways by schools. Some districts used them for one-time expenses, such as HVAC updates, and others used them to add staff to address student needs. Oftentimes it was a combination of uses. And the student needs that schools were looking to address range from helping students who had needed some learning recovery in areas such as literacy and math, so specialists in those areas, and also specialists to help students with mental health needs, I think are the biggest uses of those funds.
Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hanses, this is clearly, as you've outlined, a very busy town meeting day season, not just because of these changes that are going on, but because we have a presidential primary coming up as well and other elections this year. And earlier last month, your office's longtime director of elections stepped down. He was the head of the elections division there for a decade. I'm curious how that transition is going, and have you made progress on hiring a replacement?
So I would say that the transition is going as well as it can. I'm not going to say that that having Will Senning move on was an easy transition, but we have a really great team at the Secretary of State's office. A lot of folks who have been in their positions for a long time and have solid relationships with the municipal clerks across the state. And so with a little bit of internal reshuffling and a lot of planning, because we did have several weeks to plan for Will's departure, we feel like we're doing okay. And, we know that for this upcoming election, it's really the town and city clerks who do the lion's share of the hard work out there. And we are here as a support system for them.
And there are a couple other unique aspects to this year's elections, not just these potentially shifting ballots because of the school budget question. 16 and 17-year-olds can now vote in Brattleboro, and Burlington residents who are not U.S. citizens can now vote on local issues, joining Winooski and Montpelier. How are those changes being handled? Have you been in contact with has your office been in contact with the clerks in those cities?
We have. In fact, I was in Brattleboro yesterday and had a great meeting with Brattleboro High School students, along with Hillary Francis, the town clerk in Brattleboro, and our representative, Becca Ballant. It was a fabulous conversation. And the point of the conversation and our message to those students is, we want you to vote, and here's how you do it. And so there's one other aspect of that I want to really point out, because it touches everyone statewide, and that is, if you are 17 now and you will be 18 by the November 5th general election, you are eligible to vote in the presidential primary coming up on March 5th. And so I would encourage any young person who will be 18 by November of this year to reach out to their town clerk, get themselves on the voter registration list, and request your ballot.
Right. Well, let's get back to this issue of the school budgets and how they could change the ballots on town meeting day. We have a call coming in from Jody in Dummerston. Jody, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm from Dummerston, Vermont. A couple of things. Sue Skolowski really said a lot of what I had to say. But however, one of the things that Sue said was that schools took on all these extra social issues. I don't believe the schools, that wasn't willing. The schools had to take this on. And they are issues that should be under the general fund and not in the education fund. And that's part of the whole problem, as well as the health care. The other part of the problem, as I see it, is the state making all these laws that the school has to do, plus the Agency of Education and Board of Education. There's too many fingers in the pie, and they're not letting the towns decide what they wanted to do for their towns. The one thing that I did want to put out there is consolidation was supposed to save money, plus other things, but there's never been a follow-up to see if they are actually saving anything. I personally do not believe they are saving. I personally believe that the closer to your chest and budget your budget is, the better it is for the towns, because you get a better look. Our budget down here in the Brattleboro area is like $65 million. And I can't tell you how many pages I have in front of me of the budget, but it's impossible to follow. It's impossible to know where things are really going. And I wish the state would take another look at what happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jody. And I'd love to ask Sue Siglowski about that point around school consolidation, that you just brought up. Now, as many folks know, some schools in Vermont have seen declining student enrollment, and there's been talk of closing or consolidating some schools to save money in part. Sue, what do you think is the best way to handle these schools that are dwindling in size? And to Jody's point, has there been proof that these consolidation efforts have really saved districts money?
I believe there was supposed to be a report about that. Done by the Agency of Education. I don't think that has been done. As you know, we have been without a Secretary of Education for almost a year now. So that is definitely a concern. Some of the points that were raised by Jody are very true. The bulk of a school board budget, 80 to 90%, is based on salaries and benefits. And so the impact in order to be able to reduce costs has to be made in either adjusting staffing ratios or some other way that you're addressing the number of staff that are serving all of the students in Vermont.
Well, let's go to another caller from Plainfield, Andrea, who I think has a perhaps similar point on this topic. Andrea, go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Andrea from Plainfield. I am, as you might hear on my accent, not Native American, but I'm now a citizen. But I became a teacher in Germany first, then taught on a German school overseas in South America, and came to America to check out the alternative schools and fell in love with many aspects of the American life. But I find the school system very frustrating in many ways. I raised 4 daughters here in Plainfield, and 3 of them did really well. One had a really hard time, and I had to homeschool her for many, many years because she has autism and epilepsy. And I found that the administrative part of the American school system is not educationally prepared enough to deal with the inclusion of special needs kids and highly overpaid. So, for example, in Germany, just in case one wants to look a little over the fence and see what neighbors are doing over the ocean on the other side and why their school systems are so much more better in their results. Better for teachers, they get much higher salaries. Better for student outputs. They have much better grades, and they go many less hours to school, actually. They all go home for lunchtime, and they stay home. And so we are having the sports, for example, in private clubs in the afternoon, not all involved in the school as well. And our administrators are secretaries, and that's it. There are no highly paid principals or supervisors at all.
Andrew, I'm going to hop in here because I'd love for Sue to comment. Sue, it sounds like Andrea is comparing some of what's going on in the U.S. education system to what's happening in her home country of Germany. And one difference she points out is the wages of administrators and other top earners at schools and in the school district. Do you see that as a place that some schools could cut?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, 80 to 90% of a school board's budget is in salaries and in benefits. So that is one place that a school board will look in adjusting staffing ratios. And each individual school board would need to look at their own individual situation to see what would be appropriate.
Well, thank you, Andrea, for your call. Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hansis, as we've discussed in this program, there's a lot of change going on right now as the clock to town meeting day ticks down. Could you reiterate again for folks who have been listening and are like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be voting on town meeting day. What if I already have my ballot and I've voted on the school budget and my neighbor in the town over is saying something totally different? Where should people go for information if they are confused?
So for information on your local voting issues, I would recommend reaching out to your municipal clerk. Chances are the clerk has been in contact with your school district and knows what the plan is in terms of whether your district is planning to revote the entire ballot or just the budget articles of the ballot. By reaching out to your town or city clerk, you can also request your presidential primary ballot. And you can request any of those local ballots to be mailed to you as well. And so I think those are your go-to people for all things voting on town meeting day in March.
And Secretary, any broader concerns about election integrity, especially as we are talking right now about semi-last-minute changes to ballots and the different ballots that different individuals in a town might receive? Or is this kind of what you all are set up and prepared to handle?
Well, there's always the complicating factor of voter confusion, right? We don't want voters to decide not to participate because they don't understand how to participate. We also don't want people to mistakenly think they have already voted by returning a ballot if the school district has decided to rewarn the entirety of that ballot. And so, in the recommendations that we joined with the School Boards Association and the Superintendents Association to send out to school districts, we said, please communicate with your voters. Please be as proactive as you can. And the legislature has said in the course of passage of H 850 that districts will be able to be reimbursed for the costs of doing that voter outreach.
And then briefly, before we wrap up, Sue Siglowski, do you have a sense of how many school boards are in favor of delaying their budget vote this year?
I don't have any numbers. I think it's really playing out a lot this week, Michaela. So I just would say we're all in this together. Vermonters value their schools as a vital piece of the fabric of our Vermont communities, and I would encourage listeners to stay engaged with their local school officials who will be communicating about how it's playing out at the local level.
Well, Vermont School Board Association Executive Director Sue Siglowski and Secretary of State Sarah Copeland-Hanzas, thanks to you both for joining us this hour.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.